But there is another external relationship here, which is shareholders. Investors and shareholders are looking much more closely at the way in which management teams are running their businesses on this sort of front, aren't they? They're very keen to see creative responses to this question of diminishing returns from cost cuts.
I think the shareholder spring earlier this year, and which has been nascent for some years to come, has kicked into gear that a lot of organizations are looking to, as if they are pension funds or investment funds in some way, shape or form, how to make better returns, improve the returns. And they're looking for intelligent questions to pose and challenges to pose to the management that they're engaging with. And from the conversations I've been having with some of the shareholder activists and shareholder representation groups, they are interested in angles of approach which give a different set of insights into how businesses run and what's driving businesses. And so there's been quite a lot of enthusiasm about this particular research, because it does put completely different, it's a completely different prism, facet of the prism through which one can view business.
Is there a sense then that there's this old saw, you can't cut your way to growth? I mean, is there a sense that unless companies are taking this more creative approach and looking things mostly, that actually that's the message that will end up coming through?
So I think if you start at the premise, which nature abhors a vacuum, so if you don't get, whether it's procurement or finance leading the charge on this, what you're likely to end up happening is that people will fall back and businesses will fall back on a simple answer, which is saying, look, I'd like the same, but do it for 2% less, please, or 3%, whatever the percentage is. Well, I think there is the opportunity to start to say that you can use your suppliers not as a mechanism to get budget cuts, but as a mechanism to actually drive your business forward. And that's the great opportunity here. It's a reflection of the reality of your business, and embrace that reality and take advantage of that reality, get out there, mobilize them, and think, look what can be done, because it actually turns out you've got 5 times more resource going out to your suppliers than you have to your colleagues. So think how much more powerful if you could get both of those on fire on your behalf.
Yeah. Just a quick reminder, everyone, we're half an hour in. If you do have questions or comments about some of the things and the questions we're raising, do type them into that box on the right-hand side of your screen. We're always happy to hear from you if you've got something to flag up. So Guy was talking there, Jamie, about the sort of role of finance, and perhaps because it does see across the business, perhaps because it is responsible for numbers, it does appear to have a sort of natural home there. But finance loves transparency, doesn't it? Finance function wants to see this stuff instinctively, doesn't it?
Of course it does. Of course we love transparency, but I think the reality, Richard, is that it can be difficult to do sometimes, to drive that transparency in particularly larger, more complex businesses. You know, it never ceases to surprise me the number of conversations I have with finance leaders or CFOs just about the cost base around the finance function itself in larger organizations, never mind the rest of the cost base and sort of third-party suppliers and so on. So getting that transparency requires a lot of strong finance leadership, and it's really about, you know, that sort of finance influence in the business and working closely with colleagues. I think,
Jamie, sorry, say that it was one of the questions we've just been posed, actually, is that the question is posing, what do I do in a scenario where my chief exec likes dabbling with deals? What do I do in a scenario where the business is resistant? This is not easy. You're dealing with a generation or more generations of cultural resistance to how to think differently about their own organization, and sometimes there's an appetite within IT or chief exec that they like doing deals themselves. Of course there is, but being honest about the nature of the challenge and the fact that there is something that we must try and do, that we have got to find a new narrative to engage with the business at large, and once one does start engaging on terms that are broader than whether it is savings or process, and moving into a bigger thing, that this is actually a way of building your business more successfully. Each organization will have to construct a slightly different story, a slightly different narrative that will resonate with both the organization and the senior execs within it. But I want to try and give you hope that these narratives do exist.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to add, and let's not forget, because this is an important point, is that actually, if we think about business processes, very few business processes are constrained to particular functions.
Yeah.
You know, most business processes cross-function.
Correct.
So it makes sense to have a much more joined-up approach culturally within the organisation, because if you don't have that, then you don't get visibility on those processes, and you're not able to make join the dots, if you like, and make the connections to sort of drive some of the benefits that we're talking about. So having that sort of end-to-end process visibility, I think, is really important. And the way you get that, apart from perhaps sort of changing the organisation construct, is making sure you have the right sort of culture in place.
Well, we were talking about this a second ago as a leadership issue, and I would say this being a professional journalist, but the narrative that you construct around these kind of things does seem to be very important. And to answer the question, or to go back to the question about the chief exec dabbling, it may well be that they think the narrative is driving the lowest cost from a particular supplier because they remember the thrill of the deal from when they were a junior manager, and constructing a different narrative, presumably, around, for example, a more strategic approach to supply, could still leave them in a position to be part of a negotiating team, just with a different set of objectives, perhaps, than they used to.
I think that's right, and I think in terms of one of the opportunities is certainly that might help narrative construction is greater transparency. You see it from the slide at the moment, the implications for finance leaders. There is huge disparity between the quality of information that is available to the sales community and the quality of information that is available to the finance and procurement community within any business. So I see organizations very comfortable at spending millions, tens of millions, for the ability to slice and dice every last piece of sales data to improve margins. Getting that greater, an equivalent level of visibility and insight in order to make really smart decisions and infer behaviors and infer strategic objectives and align those objectives with what suppliers are doing is possible. It is at least enabled in part by having greater transparency and visibility of information. You know, what gets measured gets done. And I think there's an implication partly for finance leaders in terms of helping them. It's something that they're comfortable with. I'm chartered accountant, I'm comfortable with, but it's also for everybody, because what it gives is stories. What it gives is insights that you can use to frame why there's a problem, frame why there's an opportunity, frame what the direction of travel needs to change.
And it's interesting, one of the comments that's just popped up is from someone suggesting that one of the problems is that when engineers run a company, for example, they have that more holistic view of the organization, perhaps, because they're experts in their particular field. And there's a risk when professional managers, or I think there was a pejorative reference to accountants there, so apologies for that, Jamie, you know, come in to run businesses, they perhaps don't see the nuances when they're talking about things like outsourcing. But I think, in a way, Guy, that's what you're saying, is that unless you take that rounded view, unless you're joining those dots, that's precisely the problem you do get into, cuts that go into the muscle.
Nature abhors a vacuum. So if you don't come up with a narrative to take to your business, a story to take to your business that is bigger and richer than here are savings that come from my suppliers, don't be surprised if the business comes back to you and says, look, all I want is savings from your suppliers. Okay? So what I'm saying is this research suggests to me that business has profoundly changed. This research suggests to me that we can't run businesses anymore without expecting suppliers to have a profound impact on the way they operate. That is inevitably not just a case of little stuff at the margin about whether there is a stationary contract or not, but it's profound things about the nature of what is being built, manufactured, designed, innovated, etc. And we need to harvest those arguments and make people aware of them, because it's amazing. Just as I was rather surprised to discover just how important the supply community is to the turnover of the FTSE 350. And it was a bit of a revelation to me, and I've been doing this for nearly 2 decades. I think it's a revelation to most people. I think when we asked you, and you kindly all filled in some insights of whether you were surprised by a number, just over 70% of you, and you're the more interested at the end of the spectrum, said you were surprised by it. I've asked over 40 FTSE 250 and 100 directors so far what they think the number was, and only one of them so far suggested that they thought the labour costs were less than 40%.
Jim, I wanted to bring you back in. Do feel free to say what you were going to say a second ago, but I wanted to also add this idea of finding this this middle ground, if you like, between these external forces which are so compelling, the need to be able to take this holistic view, and then saying, well, where do the opportunities present themselves? I know that you, for example, and it's on the slide at the moment, global business services is a good example of where you needn't necessarily sacrifice a strategic, holistic view of the business for despite accepting the fact that these big customers.
Absolutely, Richard, and I'll come back to global business services in a second. I just wanted to touch on or sort of follow on from the points that Guy was making. So we've talked about sort of, if you like, the cultural change. We talked about the narrative, but the other things that I see in terms of really sort of facilitating and helping this process along, or if you like, some of the challenges that I continue to see, and I am speaking from a finance perspective, again, is certainly ongoing issues around technology. So have we really got sort of access to the sorts of technology that we need in businesses and in the finance function to start to really drive some of these synergies in procurement? So I think technology is an ongoing challenge, multiple ERP systems, etc., etc. And also, of course, there's a huge implication for the finance function in terms of whether or not we've got the requisite skills. And there's been so much talk about business partnering over the last few years, but it still is the case that there is a challenge in terms of have we got the right sorts of finance people with the capabilities that can go into and work with the procurement function very closely to drive the sorts of efficiencies that we see, because that calls into play a completely different sort of skill set. The point about global business services, I think, really is around, I guess, sort of the organizational construct here. So obviously, I think sort of we're all familiar with the advent of shared services and outsourcing, and I guess sort of one of the advantages of this move towards global business services is to try and drive these sort of cross-functional synergies that I think we've been talking about, and I think in the main that's been reasonably successful so far. So that's certainly something that I think sort of increasingly, and again I'm speaking from a finance perspective, CFOs, finance directors are looking at that sort of model of delivery to try and drive those